Thank you all.
Oh yes, silence your cell phone.
Thank you for that announcement. That's very helpful. I will say at any point in time during this presentation, feel free to interrupt, ask questions. I certainly like that approach instead of waiting till the end. Just to give a bit more background, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but at least a little bit. I primarily, as was said, I primarily teach engineers. A subset of that, I primarily teach PhD students. So many of my courses, not all, but many of my courses are related to the ethics of research. So our PhD students at Georgia Tech are required to take a research ethics course. Many of them, again, have me as their instructor, but there are other courses that are similar across our campus. So that's among the things I do on our campus is teach research ethics to engineers and others. In terms of my own research, this is one of the areas, obviously, and I'll say a little bit more about that as we go forward. Other areas pertaining to my research relate to robot ethics. So as was just mentioned, one of the articles that that just came out recently relates to whether robots should help nudge user behavior, more or less in a positive direction. So if any of you have a Fitbit, for example, or any health kind of app that helps remind you to walk or do other forms of exercise or to eat right or something of that sort, among the things I've been working on is whether robots should do similar kinds of activities. Now, in terms of this particular talk, what I'm endeavoring to do, as the title suggests, is to give an overview of ethical issues relating to self-driving cars. I do not promise to solve all problems, or in fact, many, if any, in this session. What I'm trying to do is just highlight some of the issues that I think engineers and others need to be thinking about as self-driving cars make their way onto the roads with more regularity. As we're beginning this, I would like to acknowledge two professors that I've been working with on a project related to this presentation tonight. It's an article that should make its way into IEEE Technology and Society magazine. So if any of you are IEEE members, which I assume at least some of you probably are, if you receive Technology and Society magazine, there'll be an article that overlaps with some of this presentation, not all of it, but some of it, making its way into that publication probably in spring, if not in summer. Anyhow, my two main collaborators that I've been working with, one is an electrical engineer at North Carolina State, Joe Herkert, and a computer scientist, Dr. Keith Miller, and his name will appear again as I move forward. To give you a sense of what I plan to do, this is the outline, which is probably a little bit of small type there for those of you in the back of the room, but don't worry too much about it. It just gives you a sense of where I'm planning to go. More or less what I'm going to do, largely for the first half, is just highlight a large collection of ethical kinds of issues pertaining to self-driving cars. And towards the second half, I'm going to focus more specifically on a subcategory of ethical issues pertaining to self-driving cars, issues emerging out of design decisions whether to pursue level 3 automation versus level 4. The automation categories, I'm assuming, are probably familiar to at least some of you, but if not, I'll have those highlighted in just a minute. So I'm guessing this is an audience that probably does not need much of an introduction to self-driving cars, but I'll say at least a few words just in case to preface or introduce the subject matter. And among the reasons why people are pursuing this with such gusto, meaning companies like Tesla, Ford, and others, is it's perceived, self-driving cars in various forms or formats, to have all sorts of different kinds of benefits, including one that we were talking about over dinner, potentially easing congestion. So for instance, if all cars went at the same rate or same speed, instead of the inconsistent speeds and driving practices that humans have, this potentially could ease congestion, save on fuel, etc. Others will suggest, in terms of the potential benefits of these cars, that you potentially lessen the need for parking. So many of you are familiar with the millennials who potentially are thinking they don't need to own a car, that they could just get one as needed, maybe rent one for a day, or take Uber or other kinds of transportation apps, use other kinds of transportation apps to make their way around town instead of parking. Well, you can imagine this could be done with self-driving cars where you could just be picked up at a particular spot and dropped off without the need of owning the particular car. And this, for instance, could save needs on parking amongst other kinds of things. You're probably familiar with at least some of the main players in this realm. Some of them, not an exhaustive list, but some of them are listed there. And one of the estimates that we found in terms of how big the market's going to be for self-driving cars, and the distinction they make there between semi-automated and highly automated is a bit rough distinction, but I'll try to get into details of that in a couple minutes, what that may mean. But in terms of semi-automated self-driving cars, you could see the rough estimate there for what the market may be. And then highly automated, you have that number. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about what that distinction may mean. Yes?
I was wondering if the engineers designing that software should be professional engineers, because we require professional engineers to certify the safety of buildings and every project they build. Why not require them to be a professional engineer signing off the design?
Very good question, and that's among the things that my collaborators and I would probably hope that engineering communities would discuss in conjunction with manufacturers and others, potential regulators and other stakeholders in this. Should a PE or a collection of PEs sign off on a design is probably something that needs to be discussed. Very good question to add to the mix. Yes?
The number of the projected sales, is that cumulative or is that annual? In 2025, you're suggesting annual sales will be that much, or cumulative sales?
I believe the numbers would be cumulative, but that's a good question. That's a good question. I'd have to rack my brain on that source.
I believe that's cumulative.
It's got. I would think it's cumulative, but that's a good question.
Doesn't the U.S. make 10 million cars a year or something? And put it in perspective, ballpark, who knows if it's cumulative?
Yeah, that's a good question. I hesitate to say for certain because I'd have to look back to my source there. But that's a good question. I think it's cumulative, but you make a good case that it could be an annual number, but I think it's cumulative, if I'm not mistaken.
One of the major benefits is overlooked
Mhm.
is maintaining the mobility of diminished capacitor baby boomers
Mhm.
and those who are chronic DUI drivers.
Right. Which raises some issues, some of which I will allude to as we get through this. But for example, if you put someone in a car who has diminished capacity of some sort or another, do they need to be in the car with someone who could help in an emergency, for instance? So if you think, for example, you're going to put someone who has some kind of medical illness, for instance, by themselves in this car to take them to an appointment, is that going to be safe? So that's among the things that has to be addressed, and how you prevent that kind of use. Yeah.
Say if you extend the American Disabilities Act into this realm, the question of whether or not having somebody with off the body, a person with disabilities wouldn't be necessary. The design should be so that they can function as a disabled person.
So in other words, that if I'm understanding you correctly, that the self-driving car could allow different members of disabled individuals to have greater access to transportation.
The premise of the American Disabilities Act is that folks with disabilities can function as nearly freely as a person with a
Right. So certain iterations or certain versions of the self-driving car, for instance, some models of the Google self-driving car, doesn't necessarily require that you are able to step on a gas pedal or a brake, whereas models of the Tesla, including the Tesla S, would more or less require the user to potentially grab a steering wheel or step on a brake as needed. But other models, level 4 and level 5 automation, do not necessarily need the human passenger or driver, depending on what the case may be. Doesn't necessarily require of them that they intervene in the car's operation. So various members of different disabled communities would be able to ride in these cars without necessarily having to interact with them in a very direct way. So in terms of other reasons why they've been defended, you may have seen some statistics like this. 94% of the time, it's more or less suggested that the driver has some role in the accident. either lack of attention or under the influence or something of that sort, that tied into a critical reason why the accident occurs is a human being in some manner or fashion, largely the driver. Also estimates in terms of how many people die or are injured on the roads around the globe, I should say, and an estimate of how many lives could be saved by automation have also been stated, in this particular case by a computer scientist. So there are various different kinds of estimates in terms of how many accidents would be reduced, how many fatalities would be prevented, and those have been lauded as potential reasons why the self-driving car should be pursued. So you can find all sorts of numbers out there. Well, that's at least some of what's been suggested. Whether it holds true certainly needs to be discussed, and we'll get into some of that in a few minutes. The promised levels of automation, if you have not seen this before, this is what the federal government is more or less holding to these days. So when they come up with policies for self-driving cars, this is more or less what they have in mind, these 5 tiers. I'm not sure how familiar the group is, but I'll just say a few things about this as connected to other points. So more or less, just the short version of this, the Tesla S, which has the ability to, for instance, drive itself on a highway, and the human being is supposed to stay at the steering wheel paying attention, but the car can take control of the driving in some scenarios, in some circumstances, largely operates at level 2/3. It's somewhere in that ballpark. In terms of it can take over some critical tasks, but it's not taking over all the tasks, nor is it expected that the human being will be completely out of the loop in the vehicle's operation. So for instance, with the Tesla S, it's expected that a human being, as needed, potentially will grab the wheel. For instance, if you're leaving a highway and going into bumper-to-bumper traffic, potentially a human being needs to take over. And that's more or less in this kind of ballpark, level 2 or level 3. Yeah?
How about flowing with traffic? The flow of traffic is not at the speed limit. Are we technically going to permit this car to go at the closest speed limit or the new speed limit to the flow?
I'll get into that. So more or less, if everyone on 285 is going 70 and the posted speed limit is 55 or 65, are you going to permit the self-driving car to? Right. Well, that's one of the issues I plan to mention, but you might as well just bring it to the light now, is should these cars be strictly designed to follow the law? So many of us, if not all of us in the room, when you get to the stop sign, we creep through it instead of doing our full stop that potentially we should be doing. I know many times people are not fully stopping. Or if they're at a red light and they're going to turn right, they're supposed to fully wait to see for oncoming traffic, but not everyone does that, and they kind of make the right turn on a red light without fully stopping. Well, should a self-driving car fully uphold the letter of the law, and of course you can imagine this scenario that you just mentioned being one of them, how this might not work out well in actual practice. Now, in terms of some of the more advanced cars, in terms of automation, meaning advanced in the sense of taking the human driver out of the loop, nearly completely, if not completely, that would be level 4 or level 5. So level 4 arguably is what Google is pursuing. That in more or less controlled circumstances, you would probably not have a human being intervene at all. Whereas level 5 more or less means the car can do everything a human can. In dynamic driving settings, not necessarily just controlled settings like a continuous path the car drives through, but in dynamic, chaotic settings, such as going from the highway to local roads, the car at level 5 would more or less be able to do everything a human could do. And there's no expectation, or at least little expectation, that a human being would likely intervene in the vehicle's operation. Now, what I'm going to talk about later is some of the ethical issues that can emerge if engineers and others pursue level 2/3 versus 4. Why you might want to pursue one versus the other in terms of a more prudent design pathway. Yes?
Recently, I've seen a commercial for a car. It has automatic braking with the driver's assistant. It has warning when the vehicle is adjacent. It has warning when they veer out of lane.
Yes.
So what level is that?
It's likely to be 1 or 2. So depending on how sophisticated these systems are, it's likely to be level 1 or 2. So if it was lane correction, it's probably closer to 1. If it's actually taking over some of the driving in a meaningful way, it's probably closer to 2 or 3. And this is spelled out in more detail from the source, and I wasn't going to get too far into the specifics, but lane correction, again, is probably closer to 1, if not 2, depending on how sophisticated the system is. So, a quick primer on ethics. Now, I'm not going to spend a whole heck of a lot of time on this part, although I couldn't resist doing it given my background and probably the need to at least introduce a little bit of a theoretical component from the sense of philosophy into this, if you've not seen this in quite a while, if at all. So what I have here listed are 3 main kinds of ethical frameworks that are often discussed in courses, in the literature, in conversations about ethics. Even if they're not directly talked about with these labels, they often pervade the discussion. So I'm guessing many of you have talked about utilitarianism in some form or fashion, even if you didn't directly recognize it as such. So this particular kind of framework suggests that we look at consequences, and more specific than that, we try to make sure that whatever decision being made, whether it's vaccination policies, whether it's educational policies, or in this particular case, whether it's about engineering design decisions, that what should motivate these decisions is doing what's good for society, or another way of putting it, for the greater number of people. And that'll come up in some of the examples I'm about to give you. Now again, I'm not going to go through the actual theoretical frameworks in a lot of detail, but just have this in the back of your mind, that this often gets discussed in debates about ethics, that one approach to resolving these kinds of questions about what's right and wrong in terms of the design of a car or another technology is what's good for the community or what's good for the greater number. Yes?
I thought moral was its own category.
Could you say a little bit more about what you mean by that?
That is like the Christian ethic, morality.
So,
You're trying to do good for others as opposed to what the consequences are.
right, and that probably, depending on there's often tension between these 2 kinds of viewpoints in the decisions that have to be made. In this particular case with a self-driving car. And to be more specific than that, and I'll talk about this a bit later in more detail, but for instance, do you save the driver or do you save pedestrians? And how do you go about making that kind of decision if you expect that something has to be done because of inertia, because of physics, because a decision has to be made? Do you swerve or not? So these sorts of decisions have to be made, for instance, if a self-driving car is going to swerve out of the way because a baby's in the middle of the road, or it keeps going straight forward. And some of what may help inform these kinds of decisions is, well, what framework are we operating from? Or at least at a minimum, what kinds of considerations should be in the mix before deciding what design pathway is appropriate. So again, I'm just briefly highlighting this as something to keep in mind. So before I move forward, again, this looks at consequences and more or less, again, is trying to figure out, as a sum total, are the beneficial consequences going to outweigh the harmful ones? The second one more or less suggests, what's the intent behind the decision? What's the thought process that went into the decision? And can we do the right thing just because it's right and for no other reason? Factored into that is often an ethical principle referred to as respect for persons, which I can say more about if you'd like. But this is a pretty fundamental feature of views that try to work and decide what's ethically right and wrong independently of consequences. And virtue ethics I'm not really going to speak about today. But I'm certainly happy to say more about it as you'd like.
Over the past 40 years,
Yes.
medical practice has changed. It used to be the medical professionals would make decisions.
Correct.
Now there's a requirement for informed consent.
Yes.
So this would a shift from utilitarianism to technology?
I'm reluctant to simplify it in that kind of way. What I would suggest is medical practice used to be more paternalistic, which is a term that certainly can be thrown into the mix when we talk about what's ethically appropriate. So paternalism roughly meaning that an entity who thinks it knows better makes a decision on your behalf. And that used to be the standard model of medical practice. I'm oversimplifying, but as you're suggesting, that used to be the prevailing thought process is the physician knows better, let him or her decide on my behalf. And quite right, there's been more of a shift over the last 40 or so years of informed consent, more or less transferring more of the decision-making power over to the patient. And this is in part informed consent, which ties into the self-driving car as well. This is in part recognize the importance of respect for persons. That the person that's going to be affected, whether it's a passenger, driver, or in the case you mentioned, Roger, a medical patient, that they should have some power or some say over their own life. And one of the ways we do this is by showing them respect for their own autonomy, respect for the decision-making power they should have over their own life. So yes, that ties into some of this, that this has become a prominent feature of medical decision-making. So as alluded to before, I would highlight some of the key ethical issues, and this is just a broad spread of issues. I am not going to dive into a lot of depth in many, or if not most of these, but I'm trying to raise awareness if you have not seen these before, and I'm certainly happy to talk about one or more of them as we go through this. So of course, among the key kinds of issues that people will want to talk about is privacy. So as you can imagine, you get into a self-driving car, all sorts of data is going to be collected. In terms of, let's say, for example, where you're picked up and where you're dropped off. If it's a design of a car where you're supposed to interact with the car, say Tesla S for instance, what your reaction time is. Because of course, manufacturers might want to know this for obvious kinds of reasons. And because so much data is potentially going to be collected, not only by the companies, but by researchers who more or less are excited to get hold of all sorts of different kinds of data. Computer-human interaction kind of data or other forms of data that you might want. That this could raise privacy concerns in the sense of what does the passenger or driver know about the kinds of data being collected from them.
As opposed to a taxi, you have to submit your ID, your driver's license, and answer a lot of forms to become a Uber passenger.
Right.
And one was just banned the other day for drinking and vomiting in the taxi or the Uber car. He's been permanently banned from ever using.
Right. Right.
So there, as you say, there's lots of data to be collected.
Right. And you might wonder, well, at least at one dimension or facet of this, what does the passenger or driver of these cars need to know about the data being collected, if anything? Pretty good case could be made that if their livelihood's going to be affected by the data being collected, that perhaps they at least need to be warned, perhaps. But this, again, is going to be a difficult and complex conversation. Yes?
What he mentioned with Uber, too, also brings up a problem with private property rights because it is private property. So so the person throwing up in the car
Right.
had more to do with private property rights than ethics, I would say, at that point.
Right. Well, part of what may come up in this is some of the data that's going to be collected from these self-driving cars are cars that the passenger driver does not own. So,
Right. That's a little different story.
yeah. Other kinds of issues that might be of interest, pedestrians. There was an article about this in the Atlantic, I would say within the last couple of months. Long story short on this is, when you're driving around town and you see a pedestrian that's going to go through a crosswalk, and let's say in this particular scenario you're about to turn right into that crosswalk, you more or less make eye contact a lot of times with that pedestrian. Some of you may guess, can I get past that pedestrian before the pedestrian starts? And some of you are thinking the pedestrian's already making his or her way off the sidewalk, I need to stop. But there's communication going on there, right? Either through eye contact, either through hand signals. So you more or less wave the pedestrian on or the pedestrian waves you on. How is this going to be mimicked or copied by a self-driving car? So let's imagine a scenario that the self-driving car always stops if a pedestrian's ever looking at the crosswalk. You can imagine that people are going to take advantage of the self-driving car all day. The self-driving car potentially just stays there. If you're in a busy college campus, the car just never goes because students keep walking past it, even though they don't have a walk sign, but they know that car is going to stop. So how does the car communicate with the pedestrian? One way you could do this, perhaps, is to have a face on the car, has been suggested, or some kind of way that it it smiles or it gives some kind of visual indication of what it plans to do. Or maybe it has a green light on the front of the car, or red.
Or shoots flames.
Or all the lights start flashing and the car just goes real slow past
But you can
past
see,
the obstacle and then.
well, what you see here, that there can be different design pathways. That's part of it. But part of it is how do you expect the pedestrians to react to whatever the design is?
The pedestrian will see the turn signal, which he wouldn't today.
So you're expecting that pedestrians are going to respect their turn signal. If they see the turn signal, the pedestrian is going to stop.
Well, the bigger outcome I see
No,
is a
college
large
campus.
population, a mixed population of automatic cars, non-automatic cars.
Right.
Pedestrians are going to presume the car will always respect them. It's not allowed to hit me, it's against the law for that car to hit me.
Right. So that it gives you a sense that as long as we're on the roads with a mixture of cars, some self-driving and some not, you have to have some level, some way, I should say, of communicating that to a pedestrian. Because if the expectation is this car is always going to stop, as long as there's human drivers on the road, they're not.
I had someone on their cell phone step in front of my car in a parking lot.
Yeah. So this is something
There
that,
was no communication with me.
right. But you can imagine this is something that needs to be sorted through.
How do you even detect them?
Sorry?
How do you even detect the passenger?
Well, that's another thing as well, which the sensors on the car, which I will reiterate this, I'm not an engineer, so I'm not going to get too much into the specifics of LiDAR versus other kinds of sensors. But the sensors have ways of picking this up. Not perfectly at this time, but
Well, it's not a crosswalk, you know, pedestrians coming out, walking into the street in an unmarked area.
right. Well, there's a variation on that theme. Is a engineer from the University of Michigan came to speak on our campus, and he was talking about the difference between someone hailing down a cab on the side of a road, so just waving their arm, versus a police officer waving. So if it's a pedestrian waving their hand, they may be just waiting for a taxi, and you in the self-driving car could just keep on your way. It's a police officer, that probably means everyone needs to stop. And you need to be able to discern, even though it's the same or similar act of a hand wave, you need to be able to discern between those two different scenarios, that one means this car has to stop, and the other means you can go along your way. Sorry, was that a hand? Yeah.
I see all this and it just makes my head hurt. Does this mean I'm a dinosaur? Or-
Yes.
I would say the simple answer is no, because I don't think anyone has particularly figured out all of this yet. I mean, maybe some of these challenges, but I don't think any of us have particularly figured out all of them. At least I certainly don't know anyone who's figured out all this stuff yet. It's things that have to be thought through as time goes on. Assuming that this technology is going to make its way onto our roads, and it is, of course, to some degree, with lane correction, with the Teslas, with other kinds of cars that are have greater and greater amounts of automation. These things need to be discussed in greater and greater length.
Well, these cars are going to know that if a ball bounces into the street, there's likely a child following it.
Ah, good one.
I mean, most of us know that.
It has to be able to do that, the short answer. For it to be an effective technology that's safe enough to put on our roads, it has to be able to do that. Now, is it going to be perfect? No, I mean, there's no such thing as a perfect technology. But one thing that may be raised is, given the vast amounts of data that a car may potentially be able to aggregate all at once, will it react more quickly than a human? And some might argue that's the test. I'm not saying that resolves it, but that's at least what some would argue. And I think that's something that, of course, needs to be discussed. Is being better than a human driver good enough? Is that the threshold for what should make its way onto the roads? So let's say 10% of us would be quick enough to swerve out of the way and not hit the child who's chasing after the ball. If a car was better than that, a self-driving car, I should say, is better than that, is that good enough? Knowing going in, it's not going to avoid all accidents, but it would avoid more than a human driver would. Is that a good enough line? Employment, just quickly, which is a talk in and of itself. How is it going to affect truck drivers? Or how is it going to affect potentially Uber drivers? I guess at least some of you have probably heard that Uber is trying to make self-driving cars in and of itself, in addition to Ford and Tesla, Google, and the others. So Uber is interested in self-driving cars. Trucks, long-haul truckers. potentially could lose their jobs over time.
They are doing it now.
Yeah.
Some tests.
They have some test trucks runs across country with no drivers.
So as we're having very frequent conversations in the country about employment levels and about automation, if you follow the news within the last few weeks, there's been a resurgence of interest in automation. Largely people critical of it, not everyone, but a lot of people critical of automation because of lost jobs.
What's he doing in the White House?
Well, I'm not saying anything political. I'm just saying it's.
No, I'm talking about the White House in snow, where 40 cars are piling up. You know.
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, but in terms of effect on employment levels, this is an issue to be addressed. I'll skip this one for the time being, but the shorthand here is there's issues relating to all the data from the internal systems of the car being integrated with each other. So you're going to have a number of complex systems pulling together data, internal and external sensors. You have to aggregate the data, and that has to go relatively smoothly for the car to function well. But map onto that the collection of data that you might have to integrate internal to the car with external sensors. Sensors potentially on buildings, or sensors on a highway, a smart highway that potentially guides the car. So if there's an accident down the road, it tells the car to slow down. The integration of all that information has to go, I mean, there are better terms for it, but it has to go smoothly for the car to operate in a safe manner. And this, again, is this whole host of challenges relating to that. Yes?
That's something that I've thought about quite a bit, and that is when a car has to rely on some type of external sensor for it to do its thing. I always look at that and say, well, gee, what happens if you get a terrorist organization who go, by definition, those have to be open standards, and other companies who make the various sensors have to know how to make the sensor so that they can communicate.
Right.
But if you were to get a few thousand terrorists running around the country with a car that goes and emulates some random sensor, that can go and make every self-driving car around them just go completely haywire.
Yeah.
And I wonder if anybody has done any thought for that.
I know people are discussing it. I don't know how much progress they're making on it. I'm not privy to the internal workings of the companies designing these cars, but I know conversations are starting about this. Any of you see the Jeep Cherokee case where the car was hacked while the driver was in it? No. So I have a link to that. I probably won't have time to show it. But.
You do need to add safety when you communicate with other systems. You now made security a major problem for hacking.
You open up more vulnerabilities.
If you can contain it to the vehicle, you can shield it. But once you communicate externally, you're in security.
And you can see that there could be different design pathways here. That you would want to house the data, the information, as much as you can internal to the vehicle, versus you want an Internet of Things. You want the vehicles to talk to one another, or a vehicle to talk to the external environment, like in the example of a smart highway. Yes?
So going back to the employment question.
Yeah.
Is that really ever an ethical question? Because if it were, from an engineer's perspective, that would stop progress in itself. It's more a policy question than an ethical question, isn't it?
I would argue that there are ethical dimensions to it too, if there hasn't been planning made to help the population, to help the different disaffected workers. What's largely been argued historically, of course, is that unemployment is caused by innovation. But typically the hope is that other sectors open up.
But the designer of the technology, or the developing technology itself, does not pose that ethical question. That's more a policy question, isn't it?
Well, I'm not going to try to resolve this, but just for devil's advocate's sake, should the company in and of itself have a plan for the affected employees? So let's say 10,000 people in the company are going to lose their jobs whenever this thing rolls out. Does the company have...
The society as a whole. For example, if Ford and whatever car manufacturer develop a self-driving car, should they worry about that it's going to affect the employment of Uber drivers? I mean, their own employees, yes, but the Uber drivers or whatever, or truck drivers, should that be a question that Ford would have to answer as part of ethics?
That's a good question. I have my point of view on it, but I'm not going to try to resolve it here.
I'm wondering if it's ever really, from the designer's perspective, an ethics question. It seems that if that were, we would stifle innovation.
I think there is something to be said to that point of view, yes. That if you were always concerned that this could cause unemployment, yes, there is the potential to stifle innovation. But of course, the hope would be, in at least some circumstances, that would open up more opportunities. Because oftentimes technology, not always does it successfully accomplish this, but oftentimes technologies are seen as, yes, unemployment in the short term, but maybe it's liberating and opening up more employment sectors in the long run.
Sir,
Yeah.
the answer to his question is in the case study of Ford, early history. He replaced the horseless carriage, he put the horseless carriage in place of the horse.
Right, you put it, right,
Look at the impact it's had.
right.
But still, it doesn't answer the question, because my question is really, is that a question for the designer?
Right, I get your point.
Not a society as a whole, but the designer himself.
So,
It's not an ethical question.
well, I think part of it would be the person's individual moral conscience and what they reflect on as being morally right or wrong, perhaps from religious upbringing or other codes or other guidance that helps inform their decision making. Part of it is codes from their profession. So does the profession say anything about this, the individual's or community's moral responsibility for these kinds of matters? Does NSPE, for example, say anything about this kind of matter? Could be one way of addressing this issue. Part of it is corporate culture. So does this company think it has a responsibility to the larger public when making these kinds of decisions? So that's some facets of this, but the question you're asking is a very good one, and I think it's something that needs to be discussed, and I'm not going to say I can directly resolve it in all these kinds of circumstances.
But we've just seen that going
Yeah.
on, starting from the Burger King, with the conveyor belt cooking that hamburger, no longer needed a good fryer guy to
Right.
fry a hamburger to get it out. And you know darn well these McDonald's and so forth, saying 15-hour hamburgers, wages there, no, we'll automate what we can. They do it with the Coke, filling up the soda that's been.
Right,
It
right.
goes on a conveyor belt, fills up ice and right down to the end and
Right.
slap the cap on.
Well, one of the things that both of your comments raise is this is a variation on a theme. This is not the first time this sort of thing has come into emergence, and of course it's not going to be the last time. But is this, because of the broad scale of it, in terms of the potentially millions of people could be displaced from their jobs, is it something that systematically needs to be addressed by some entity? In the interest of time, I probably need to move forward a little more quickly. So unexpected user behavior, and I just gave a quick example there. The child needs to go to daycare, but the parent says, I don't have time for this, just put the child in the car and let the car go on its way. So there are issues there in terms of design decisions. Should the car move if there's just a child in the back seat? Is this something that designers, engineers, and others need to address, or is this a policy question? So that's among the things that you could think about there. We briefly alluded to tampering or hacking. The link there, which you probably cannot see very well on the screen, is to the Jeep Cherokee case. It's Wired magazine that had an article on that. I'll skip to the trolley problem. So the trolley problem, have any of you heard of that phrase before?
We have it here. The Martin trolley, the street car trolley.
Oh, okay.
This is a classic ethical dilemma where a
Yes.
trolley car can be diverted and one person may die if it continues on its path, or, fewer, all right, this is it.
No, I didn't want to cut you off. I was
No,
just giving
this
you a
is-
visual.
Right, but that's the cases where a trolley car can be, a trolley, a car, a railroad, but however the dilemma is set up. If you were in the position to make a choice and you said, I can redirect this vehicle, and instead of one person dying, not me,
Right.
3 other people would die, or 3 people would die, but I'll redirect it and only 1 person would die, is there some greater good, and who gets to make that choice?
Right. Right. So there's a variation of scenarios that go under the heading trolley problem. And this problem has been with us for many decades, at least in its modern version, largely from the 60s or 70s. And there have been various variations of it over time. In present day, a lot of it's talked about with regard to self-driving cars. And you can see this visual from MIT, and if any of you are interested in this, they give you a bunch of different scenarios where you have to choose. Would I run over 1 person? Would I run over 2? What if it was a child? What if it was an aging person? What if it was a person with a baby carriage? What if it was a dog? What if, you get the point. The overarching issue is, at what point is it acceptable to potentially run over people versus sacrificing yourself? Or when's it acceptable for the car to protect the driver versus pedestrians? And again, you can model this in different kinds of ways, throw in different kinds of scenarios. In this particular, the version I gave you, it's 2 people in the car versus 2 pedestrians, and more or less what this is showing is the car could make the decision to plow into a barrier, potentially costing the lives of the people in the car, or you potentially preserve the people in the car and run over the pedestrians. Now, going back to those ethical frameworks I talked about, you potentially want some logic and reason thrown into this in terms of what's rational, acceptable for the car to do, assuming that you cannot save everyone because of physics, because of inertia, because of the lack of time. Excuse me. So this is one scenario that's often talked about with regard to the cars. And it's often talked about because what are designers going to do if a car is confronted with this? How are they going to program the Google car, the Ford car, the Uber car? How are designers in their factories, in their labs, how are they going to resolve this, assuming this is going to be a situation they're going to confront? Yeah.
Have they faced the issues of where if the car gives a command to steer or brake and nothing happens, what's the fallback position plan B?
So,
for example, it may not realize it's on black ice. It's not going to get steering or braking responses that it normally would expect. And what does it do?
So in some design, when you pursue certain design pathways, so let's say level 2 or level 3 automation like I described before, in principle the human driver is supposed to still be there behind the wheel paying attention, and if the automated system is not reacting appropriately, presumably the hope is the human driver will take over.
That's presuming the human driver is
Paying attention.
has the level of alertness that he would
Right.
have if he was driving.
Right. It's assuming a lot,
Which is not good.
but at least there's a
Which would
fall.
be the case.
But some would argue at least there's a fallback. There's a human fallback. Versus level 4, level 5, you're not assuming much of anything of the human in terms of their interaction with the car. So if the car fails in the way you describe, it has. What's the design?
It's not
Car
gonna-
completely stop. What does it do?
Actually, that was a trick question because the driver doesn't know what to do either.
Well, you may be right about that too.
Most drivers.
Most drivers wouldn't know what to do either.
So this is where I highlighted a little bit of this already, but this is where I wanted to direct the focus for probably most of the remaining time that we have. Is we've talked a little bit about different design pathways for these cars. So I'll give a quick refresher, level 3 versus level 4. Level 3 is more or less have in mind something like a Tesla X, where the car could do a lot of significant driving, let's say on a highway, on its own. But the human is more or less supposed to still be there behind the wheel, still has access to the accelerator pad and the brake. So the car can take over a lot of the significant driving tasks, but the human is still there to take over. Versus level 4, where more or less the assumption is the human is not significantly in the loop. The car, probably in a relatively controlled setting, let's say on a loop, that it takes workers around a complex, that it's assumed that the human is really not going to be actively involved in the vehicle's operation. What are the benefits or drawbacks to either of these design pathways? What would make it potentially defensible to pursue one versus the other? And among the things I wanted to do is to highlight some of the reasons why you might want to pursue one versus the other. More or less, again, keeping a human in the loop of the vehicle's operation versus more or less coding them out of it. So this highlights some of the, at least of what I saw, some of the potential benefits and drawbacks to level 3. Again, the human being supposed to be behind the wheel, paying attention, taking over the vehicle's operation as needed. And I'm certainly happy to talk about any of these or comment on any of these that you'd like.
I think everybody should know that the recent studies show that if you let the car do something and you depend on it doing it, you are too late to do anything about avoiding a problem if you get into trouble.
So right, so switching it over from the automated system.
Automated to a driver recontrol,
So
too late.
So that's one of the significant complaints or criticisms of this design pathway, is if you hit, let's say, black ice, and the car doesn't know what to do, and it's expecting, the expectation is the human is going to take over, the reaction time of the human is probably not going to be quick enough.
Well, it's not-
Assuming they're paying full attention, it's probably still not going to be.
The studies in Michigan were very painfully apparent that if the car alerted the driver to do something, too late.
Yep.
By the time the driver realizes what's got to be done and takes action, it's all over.
So that could be a significant complaint about this design pathway, very definitely.
So what would, like you're on an airplane
Mhm.
and most of the trip is on autopilot, but
Yes.
they're gonna land it themselves, would that be level 3 or level 4? Like the driver's that, or the pilot's gonna know to take over to land and to take off.
I would say probably in the ballpark of level 3, because the expectation is the human is still there to take over. So if the autopilot is having trouble, let's say, for example, with turbulence, the human is still supposed to be there to interact with it, to take over as needed. So in my, again, I'm not an engineer, but my opinion would probably be in the ballpark of level 3.
Right, and the key difference there is at 30 or 40,000 feet and spatial separation, there's time to react, to assess situation. The alarm goes off, the pilot takes over the controls.
Right. So you raise a very good point as how analogous is the commercial flying example, for instance, to the case of a self-driving car.
It's not, because from a reaction time standpoint, most of what we experience on the roads here, people have already exceeded the reaction time. You know, travel distance, separation distance on the interstates and so forth.
Yes.
Yeah, but even so, there's been an awful lot of study on the man-machine interfaces in aviation.
Yes. And at least some of those cases, I'm not sure where you intended to take the point, but in some of the cases it's been argued that the human pilots overcorrect, overreact to the data they're seeing from the system. And in some circumstances this has caused crashes. So one of the,
Well, some of them have forgotten how to fly,
So
too.
there should be a level 6. No human interaction at all.
well, that's more or less level 5 is what is more or less that ballpark.
But I thought it said, it doesn't expect human interaction, but there can be human.
Well, level 5 is more or less the idea that the system could pretty much mimic whatever a human could do. It wouldn't necessarily eliminate all human interaction, but it more or less can handle what a human can handle.
I'm perceiving that what we're discussing, for the most part, is did the designers think of this exception? Did the designers think of that exception? Did the designers think of that exception? And those exceptions really don't address limitations of the ethics. They're kind of outside of the ethic. If you presume the designers do a thorough job, they're encompassing the unexpecteds in their design of their software and hardware. But you still have the issues of ethics behind, such as, do you do this choice of solution or that choice of solution?
So are you referring back, for example, to like the trolley problem? Is that what you're getting at? So yes, those issues still, of course, linger in this. So, for instance, for level 3 versus level 4, are you expecting a human being to resolve those kinds of dangerous scenarios? Whether you run over the pedestrians or swerve the car. In the case of level 4, you're more or less assuming that the programmers, the coders, the engineers are deciding this in advance. That the system in and of itself has a solution to deal with these kinds of circumstances. Now those, I don't know how far to go down this road, so to speak, but with level 4, presumably what would be argued in its defense is that the system would react presumably more quickly because it would have more data on hand to do so, rather than relying on a human being to help make the decision.
And it's always attentive.
And yes, in level 4, the system is always paying attention. It's supposed to be in level 3 too, but the assumption is that the human's going to be there to help as needed. Yes?
Doesn't at least one of the cars in production or being proposed to have no driver controls?
Certain models of the Google car, yes.
No steering wheel, no
Yes.
pedals?
Yes, which I haven't gotten into fully why some people think that could be problematic. But yes, certain versions of the Google car There is no steering wheel or no pedals.
That sounds like level 5.
It's likely level 4 in the sense that a lot of those cars are expected to operate in relatively controlled settings. Meaning they're probably only going to operate in local roads where the speed limit is relatively low, or probably only operate in certain chunks of the highway, but probably not jump between different environments.
Like downtown New York.
Right, so it's probably not going to jump between different chaotic settings. It'll probably work well in a relatively controlled setting. Just quickly, if you have not heard of the ELIZA effect, this is largely back several decades ago in the 60s/70s, a computer program that was used for therapy, and people would talk to it on their computer. More or less, you type in a message and it would reply back. What they found is people started to treat it like it was human-like, even though it was relatively simple. People would project onto it like, whoa, this thing can help me. Would project onto it personality. So the long story short here, the ELIZA effect is this general idea that people might project onto a system, in this case a computing algorithm, properties or traits it doesn't truly possess. And mapping it onto a self-driving car, are the passengers and the drivers going to expect of the car things the car really can't do? And that, of course, can be a problem if the driver is supposed to operate the car in a certain way and expecting the car to do it instead of the driver.
I thought that was the Black Knight effect.
That was the teenager effect.
There may be different variations of this, but at least one of them is called the ELIZA effect. So in terms of level 4, some of this we discussed a little bit already. This is more or less, again, taking the human being out of the loop. It could mean, for instance, removing the steering wheel, as just was stated in some versions of the Google self-driving car, taking away the pedals. Some might argue that the system would potentially work better because there's fewer variables. The system doesn't have to anticipate a human interacting with it. Humans who can behave in very inconsistent kinds of ways. Some people react more quickly, more slowly. Some are intoxicated. Some are sleepy, and so forth. Well, on the downside of the drawbacks to this, what are humans going to do if they can't grab a steering wheel and they think they're in danger? So will people be willing to get into a car, for instance, where they really can't stop the car in a very meaningful way, or at least can't stop the car in a way they're familiar with? So if they don't see pedals that they're going to push with their feet, how comfortable are they going to be if they think they're in danger? Even if they're not, just assuming they think or perceive they're in danger, how might they react? So that's at least something that needs to be grappled with regard to level 4 automation. The last one here.
Don't the cars have voice recognition?
Depends on the interface. So I asked an engineer at a company who spoke at our campus, I won't name the company, but I asked the engineer who worked for that company that question. What's the interface going to be if you pursue level 4 or level 5? And the answer is, still figuring that out. Is it going to be a monitor where you see images? Is it going to be a voice? Part of the issue there is, who are you expecting to be in that car? And how do they process information? So for instance, if it's an audio warning, then a deaf person is going to be in trouble. So there needs to be some combination of warnings that's going to be suitable to whoever's going to be riding the car. Bring up before I bring this to a close and leave room potentially for a few questions. Amongst all the stuff that I tried to raise today, and potentially too briefly, but at least it was an introduction to some of these matters, what do engineers need to be doing about these sorts of things, either at the individual level or the collective community level? So do they need to be talking or speaking to whether it's appropriate to design these cars at level 3 versus level 4? Do they need to be talking about what design possibilities there may be to solving the trolley problem? Do they need to be talking about issues relating to privacy? In other words, which of these issues raised today do individual engineers and collection of engineers need to be addressing? What are their responsibilities here?
Just like
And I'm not presupposing I have the answer to that, but I'm hoping to at least raise the question for this community.
just like there's building codes, right? Could be codes for automated vehicles, right? So
And the process
so
of being
it makes
discussed,
it-
yes.
It makes a decision, you say, well, it has to be designed, in the case of the trolley, effect, right? It has to be designed this way, not the other way. You know, and then you know the rules when you get in the car, and you know that's what would happen in that situation.
So
Whether it's the right decision at the time, you know, at least it's black and white. You know that's what's going to happen.
So let me at least add 2 wrinkles to that. One is that we all agree what the solution to the trolley problem is. So let's say it's one driver in the car, and there's 2 pedestrians. Do we all agree the car needs to save the pedestrians?
No.
Probably not. So the short answer is
Depends on whether they're idiots or not.
one is can we come
It
to
doesn't matter. You make the rules and then you stick with it.
If it's a level 3 car, and the guy says, I'm taking over the car control, the car's gonna put me into the barrier, I'm taking it into the pedestrians.
Right.
Give me back the control.
Right.
I mean, because we just said if it's a level 3 car, he's gonna hit, release the auto drive.
But you couldn't react.
Well,
So it's still-
I'm just,
you still have to have
I'm just
control.
throwing out an ethical conundrum. Does the car say, no, you're not, we're going into the barrier? And
right.
is the car now deciding to override your decision?
And that's
Well-
what they figured in the court of law.
Well, right, that was going to be my second point. So one is presuming that we can come up with a solution to the trolley problem, but 2, adding the wrinkle that if there are going to be different designs of cars riding on the same roads, level 2, level 3, and so forth, they might need different codes for those different designs.
It has to be a standardization.
Or
Yes.
do we require,
I mean,
or
that
does
would be where-
standardization necessary?
That's where engineers sit around like this and decide what these ethical issues are and what codes need to apply.
Right.
What's
Uh,
the
problem with
best
standardization of codes is most of your building codes come about because of some code that's already occurred.
Right.
The codes are technical down the future. So you're going to have some failure driving the barrier, driving the pedestrians before they make a decision on how that event's going to occur.
Right. In this particular case, we're hoping to anticipate the failure before the failure happens and there's a reaction. Although that's of course natural in a lot of design, is the failure happens first and then you respond to the failure.
So the building codes are immensely simple in that it's a static system.
Well, see, that's the thing,
And
right?
that just immensely simplifies everything. So, but even in earthquake zones, it's still compared to something where you have actually no predictability of what's going to happen. I mean, earthquake you can predict based on
Well, in
what's
terms
going
of
to happen.
complexity of codes, that can change with the technology. For example, today I've been reading the ANSI code relating to power presses, stamping presses. So it's not static, that's dynamic. And yes, so the idea that because it's dynamic, it's going to be hard to write code. Well, a committee will find a way. But
I mean, it depends on the building. There's a lot of stuff in
Yes.
the building.
I want to add another level of complexity to this whole thing. I can say one word, lawyers.
Yeah.
They will make a decision.
I mean, some of what needs to be decided is, for instance, does a licensed driver need to be announced? I mean, that's just one example of a legal.
Utterly screwy way that people look at liability.
Mhm.
And lawyers look at, can I go after the person with deep pockets, et cetera, et cetera. I see manufacturers making decisions where they are informed rather bluntly by their legal team which way the decisions have to go.
Yeah, to minimize liability. I mean, that certainly is going to be part of the picture. Of
Okay, we
course.
need to educate lawyers instead of engineers.
What I was going, I know I've run out of
Yeah, 5
time.
minutes. Go 5 minutes. You're good.
I'll try to just quickly go through this. One of the take-home messages is, can codes of ethics save us from all of this complexity? And of course the short answer is no. They're well intended and of course provide guidance. But as many of you have already said, this is a highly complex set of issues that codes in and of themselves probably do not, by themselves, of course, resolve the issues. It's going to require critical thinking, discussions, meetings, and other sorts of activities to happen. If it's of interest, one of my collaborators has tried to give some guidance for complicated computing artifacts, which a self-driving car would be an example of such a thing. He has an article in one of the IEEE publications, and if any of you want this, to look at this publication, I can send you the link to this. His name's Keith Miller, and time there is kind of blocking it, but it's called, well, I can't seem to move it, but anyway, Moral Responsibility for Computing Artifacts, the Rules. It talks about what computer scientists, computer engineers, and others should be thinking about relating to these complex kinds of technologies. I am not promising it resolves all of this, but it's supposed to spark more discussion amongst computing and other communities about these kinds of technologies. And again, he's one of my collaborators on some self-driving car projects. My references, which the links there kind of disappeared. And probably most importantly, which is again hard for you to see, is my last name, Borenstein, at gatech.edu if any of you want to follow up on any of this. Thank you for your time and attention. Yeah.
What does the insurance industry think about all of these changes?
Some will make the argument that a key reason why self-driving cars haven't shown up on the roads as much as they potentially could is because sorting out the insurance-related issues. Who's going to be at fault? Who gets blamed? To what degree? I think if this is what you're suspecting, that resolving those complexities have made it difficult to figure out what's going to happen. And made it difficult to decide, well, should a self-driving car appear on the roads of Georgia, California, and other places? Yes, the insurance-related issues have been a big part of it. But I think, well, let me just quickly add to that. One is who's at fault when an accident happens. But two, another expected effect over time is, will insurance even be needed? Pie-in-the-sky optimism. If accidents go away, will we need insurance? I don't think we're anywhere close to that anytime. But that's another related issue that gets discussed. But the more common or frequent one is the prior issue.
We're actually closer than you think because we've had cruise control for how many years? Analog brakes. We've had computerized suspension systems and braking systems for 20 years. Already incorporated. Airbags, all of that. No, we're already into it. That'll be settled eventually through legal systems, the insurance companies.
Right. It'll take time though. To sort out who's at fault or who's to be blamed and to what degree.
Has the ethical discussion on cars been influenced by even some of the science fiction on robots? Rule number 1: robots shall not harm people.
Yeah, Asimov.
Isn't a self-driving car ultimately just a robot in this scenario?
Well, it's a robot in some sense, but I think most of us would say Asimov's rules do not really work by themselves. They may be good thought tools and good science fiction, and they're good for discussions. I mean, for all of us can sit down with the rules, but
they can help lead.
They help frame
this discussion.
Right.
How would you, if rule number 1 leads to rule number 2, correct rule number 1, thou shalt not harm. But the trolley problem poses a conundrum.
Right.
Not harm. Who? Which one?
If someone needs to be harmed, and Asimov's rules really don't give you a solution.
Right.
You gotta get rid of the idiots first.
Well, Jason, on behalf of the Atlanta chapter, GSPE.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We hope you enjoyed this recorded presentation given at one of the Atlanta Metro Chapter meetings of the Georgia Society of Professional Engineers, an affiliate of the National Society of Professional Engineers. To find out more about us or to join us, check us out at gspe.org.